She marched in with a designer bag and a last name, not a resume. By noon, I was fired. By 3 p.m., I handed her the master keys. She thought she inherited a desk. I owned the deed. The first time I saw her, she was standing in my doorway like she already owned the place. She wore arrogance like a fragrance, thick, expensive, and meant to be noticed. Her heels clicked on the polished concrete like punctuation marks, announcing each step with finality. No handshake, no eye contact, just one sentence. "You must be Diane. My father said you'd still be here." Still. That word hung between us like a stain. I didn't flinch. I'd worked 16 years in that building. I'd weathered 3 mergers, 2 audits, and 1 power outage that nearly fried the servers. But never before had someone walked in with a Chanel blazer and the intent to erase history. She was the founder's daughter, newly appointed CEO and already scanning the room like a realtor prepping for demolition. Her assistant, a frightened-looking intern with a clipboard, handed me a folder marked Transition Protocol. I flipped through it while she talked. Everything had been sanitized in corporate beige, reorgs, asset assessments, access revocations. One clause was circled in pink highlighter. Termination effective upon leadership transfer. Technically, she wasn't wrong. The contract did allow for immediate separation. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was the timing of the lease and the true ownership structure behind the company's prize jewel, the campus. "You'll have 30 minutes to collect your things," she said, glancing at the clock. "Security will escort you." I closed the folder quietly. Outside the window, the central courtyard glowed under the soft amber of late afternoon sun. I had watched every brick of this place get laid. I had signed off on every HVAC installation, every zoning approval. It wasn't just where I worked. It was part of me. "You'll want the keys then," I said, voice even. She looked puzzled. "Keys?" I opened my desk drawer and retrieved a thick black envelope. Inside, 7 engraved keys, 2 access cards, and a flash drive labeled ownership record. Her assistant reached out, unsure. "You're handing over," I smiled. "Everything, just like she asked." She took the envelope like it might explode. The real explosion came minutes later. Downstairs in the legal suite, a junior counsel scanned the flash drive and went pale. He sprinted up the stairs, bypassing security. "Wait," he gasped to the new CEO clutching the folder. "You fired her before she assigned—" Too late. And that was just the beginning. She thought she was inheriting a team. What she didn't know could cost her the campus. By morning, her name was still on the parking sign, but her composure, gone. The CEO's lawyer, young, polished, Ivy-trained, showed up at my apartment before 8 a.m. He wore urgency like an aftershave. I met him at the door in yoga pants and a mug that read, "Contracts are won in silence." "Miss Diane," he began, clutching a document folder like it was a lifeline. "There appears to be a misunderstanding regarding the termination sequence and, the property lease." "Misunderstanding," I echoed as I sipped. "Let me guess. You fired the one person holding the legal signature to the entire campus lease?" His eyes darted. "You weren't listed as an owner." "Correct," I cut in. "I'm the grantor. The original lease is held in trust through a series of shell entities. The operating company pays rent. Guess who signs off on that rent?" He swallowed. The silence between us was louder than litigation. 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly transferred the real estate rights to a protective holding, a move prompted by whispered rumors of boardroom changes. I'd seen the memo naming her as interim successor. That word, interim, was a red flag waving in a storm. She didn't just inherit a chair. She inherited a minefield, and she'd stepped right on it. Back at the office, I knew chaos would be simmering. The facilities team couldn't access the central utility system. HR was locked out of compliance files. Even Zoom calls weren't syncing. The master calendar, still registered under my credentials, flagged every meeting as unauthorized host. By noon, 3 departments had called my personal cell. I didn't pick up. Let them sweat. Let her explain to the board why the termination sequence skipped legal review. Meanwhile, the building's biometric scanner, installed 2 years ago, had just reverted to admin lock mode. No one could enter the West Wing, including her. But the real twist came when a courier delivered a letter to my doorstep. a formal reinstatement offer. Same title, new terms, one condition, silence. I read it twice, then laughed. They wanted me back, but quieter, disposable, invisible, a technician, not a threat. What they forgot. I don't fix what I architected. She hadn't just fired an employee, she had activated a clause I wrote myself. If she had read past page 7 of the transition binder, she'd know. Some resignations only look like exits. Ever seen a CEO lose a campus over a rushed decision? Drop a comment if you've witnessed corporate karma in real time. By the end of the second day, she had already summoned an emergency board meeting. The email was terse, riddled with words like restructure, urgent oversight, and the ominous asset ambiguity. In translation, she had no idea what she controlled. Or didn't. I knew where she'd be. The fourth-floor glass conference room with the 270-degree skyline view. She loved that view, thought it made her look powerful. What she didn't know? That room still had a wired feed into the original security system. A feed I installed. For emergencies, of course. I didn't need audio to see it unravel. One by one, board members walked in with printed packets, likely the same ones her assistant had sent the night before in damage control. But something was off. 2 members weren't just confused. They were furious. One even slapped the table. That would be page 14. The ownership record I had quietly registered a year ago. The company operated the campus, but I owned the core infrastructure, from the lease to the proprietary energy systems. Systems I had architected, funded, and, in a rare stroke of strategic paranoia, licensed back to the company under a renew-as-agreed clause she had ignored. As their voices rose, she tried to hold posture. She smiled, nodded, and spoke with that same affected calm she'd used on me, back when she thought HR protocols were protection enough. But the walls were caving. Across town, I sat at a coffee shop that still smelled of varnish and ambition. My laptop pinged. An encrypted email from a board observer. The subject line was simple. She's unraveling. Inside, a screenshot of her printed termination order, and a note that made me pause. She listed gross insubordination as cause. There's no clause for that. You could sue. I didn't want revenge, but I did want the truth documented. So I pulled up the original contracts. All of them. The ones buried in legacy servers HR had never touched. And I started exporting. By 6 p.m., the West Annex had no power. By 6:20, the CEO's office access credentials were revoked. Not by me, by the automation system that recognized an expired lease authorization. And by 7, she was on her 3rd call with legal. They say grief has 5 stages. Corporate downfall only has 1. Panic. When someone builds the foundation, don't try to evict them without checking who holds the blueprints. She made the mistake of thinking ownership ended at paperwork. The real control? That lived in the forgotten spaces between policies, the unspoken rituals of a place, the morning code resets, the unarchived vendor agreements, the 5-year maintenance schedules logged under my name, not facilities, and most importantly, the renewal trigger on the master lease set to auto-lapse without my biometric approval. She hadn't just fired me. She had ejected the one person who understood the heartbeat of the entire operation. By day 3, she stopped using the main elevator. Rumor was someone had reprogrammed it to bypass her floor. Petty? Maybe. But I didn't do it. The system had. Because someone named Diane, had built redundancy into the access scripts. For emergencies, of course. Meanwhile, vendors started pulling out. The landscaping crew didn't show. The data center's climate control provider requested re-verification of service authority. Even the coffee supplier froze delivery after seeing a bounced payment flag. The company account was under restricted review, a side effect of the termination sequence she had triggered too soon. And then came the audit letter. An external firm, previously contracted by me, had received a system alert about conflicting metadata in the founder's transfer agreement, an agreement I had helped draft. It stipulated that no successor could claim full executive rights until operational continuity was verified by the prior signatory, that is, me. Oops. The clause wasn't flashy. It sat buried deep in legalese under appendices and exhibits, but it was enforceable. and it had just activated. Her assistant tried to downplay it. Just a technicality, he said in a trembling voice over voicemail. But in corporate law, technicalities write the headlines. And the board? They were getting restless. Some had invested not just in the product, but in the campus itself, expecting long-term returns tied to the lease, returns now in jeopardy. A red Range Rover pulled up outside my building that evening. She stepped out, alone, without makeup, without entourage. She buzzed my door. I didn't answer. She waited 5 minutes. Then slipped a letter through the slot. It wasn't apology. It was desperation. When someone treats you like you're replaceable, let silence explain how infrastructure works. Day 4 brought a new kind of storm. Not the kind that flashes on weather alerts. This one brewed in inboxes and hastily convened Zoom calls where voices cracked and backgrounds blurred from panic. Every hour revealed another fracture she couldn't plaster over. A client contract worth $2.7 million was flagged as invalid due to a mismatch in contract timing. Turns out, I had delayed execution by 72 hours to align with fiscal protections. She had sent an update too early and the timestamp voided a clause. The client walked. Her assistant, poor kid, called me from a burner phone. His voice shook. "They're saying you manipulated the systems." I almost laughed. "I didn't manipulate anything," I said. "I just knew what not to touch." That's the difference between builders and inheritors. We know where the seams are. We know which screw, when loosened, hums a warning before collapse. And collapse was coming. The company's insurance provider issued a coverage pause. Not cancellation, not yet. Just a pause pending internal review of leadership legitimacy. In translation, they no longer trusted her authority to make the binding decisions. And then came the real crack. One of the board members, a silent investor from the original founding group, requested a full audit of asset control. He used words like fiduciary duty and structural fraud. The room tilted, because tucked inside the audit request was a clause I knew would surface eventually: review of all founding infrastructure grants and conditional assignments. And there it was. My trump card, without me lifting a finger. The audit team would discover the clause stating that if terminated without cause prior to succession completion, the original operational architect retained temporary administrative control. Me, not out of spite. Out of design. Meanwhile, she sat in the executive wing surrounded by glass, but isolated like an animal in a display case. Every visitor looked through her, not at her. Even the janitor stopped knocking before entering. She still had the title, but no access, no trust, no gravity. That afternoon, her voice finally cracked during a call. One of the lawyers tried to console her. "I just wanted to lead," she whispered. "But leadership isn't a chair. It's knowing how the lights stay on." They gave her the crown. I still held the power grid. By the 5th day, the story had spilled beyond the walls. Someone, probably a vendor with too much time and too many unanswered emails, leaked parts of the internal conflict to an industry blog. The headline was brutal. CEO daughter triggers meltdown, campus held hostage by former architect. Of course, I never held anything hostage, I just didn't hand it over to someone who hadn't earned the right. But perception? That was another game entirely, and she was losing it. The article cited sources, quoted unnamed executives, even mentioned the revoked ownership record keys and the terminated campus lease pathway. Every office gossip thread lit up like Christmas. By noon, the company's stock dropped 6%. Legal scrambled, PR was paralyzed, and she was advised to step back from external communication, which meant silence. That afternoon, I received a polite email. Formal tone, vague flattery, asking if I'd consider consulting during the transitional audit period. No titles, no reinstatement, just consultant. I stared at the screen for a long time. They wanted me to clean up the mess, the one caused by a rushed ego and a board that treated legacy like furniture. I replied with one sentence. Please refer to clause 9.3 of my original exit contract. That clause stated simply, no further unpaid labor, direct or indirect, shall be requested post-termination without full compensation and reinstatement of rights. They never expected I'd use it, but they should have. Because the deeper irony, the very contract they weaponized against me was crafted by me. Across the street, the campus lights flickered in the dusk, not out of malfunction, but scheduled conservation. A feature I'd programmed years ago. Sustainability wasn't just policy, it was pride. And that building still remembered me. Every keystroke, every code, every door I opened that she now found closed. She inherited a title. I became the ghost in the machine. On the 6th day, the silence broke. Not hers, mine. I received a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in 8 years. Jeremy Lee, the company's original CTO and one of the few people who remembered what the company had looked like before the glass towers and glossy branding. "Diane," he said, "I read the article. Tell me you still have the infrastructure logs." I did. Of course I did. Because I knew someday the past would be relevant again, especially when the present had been rewritten by people who thought legacy was optional. He asked to meet. Discreetly. We chose a private lounge 3 blocks from the campus. The walls were lined with velvet, the lighting warm and low, like a place designed for confession. He slid me a file, real paper, not digital. Inside were diagrams, internal reports, and a memo from the board suggesting they were considering external intervention, maybe even selling off the infrastructure unit as non-core. "They're panicking," Jeremy said. "You're the only one who knows how to unwind this without collapse." I looked at the floor plan. They'd already started reassigning systems to new departments that didn't exist when those systems were designed. Like rewiring a symphony. "You want my help?" "I want your brain," he said honestly, "but they won't ask. They're too proud, too scared." I sipped my tea. "They already offered me a consultant role," I said, "without leverage. You still have it." He was right. Because buried in the founder's original documents was a clause no one else had mentioned, not because it was secret, but because no one had cared enough to read that far. It was a legacy override clause. If the company's infrastructure was at risk of critical failure due to executive action, the original architect could invoke a 6-week stewardship to stabilize operations, even post-termination. I had 6 days left to file it. Jeremy stood to leave. "If you pull that lever, they'll come crawling." "I don't want them crawling," I said. "I want them learning." Because this wasn't revenge. This was a masterclass. The campus wasn't just brick and fiber optics. It was muscle memory. And I was the heartbeat they'd silenced. Too soon, too blindly. There's a reason blueprints are archived. Not for nostalgia. For rescue. Day 7 began in eerie stillness. Not the peaceful kind. The suspended, anticipatory quiet you feel before a storm splits the sky. The kind that hums in the walls. The kind that even the janitorial staff can't pretend not to notice. At 9:02 a.m., I invoked the clause. Legacy override. Form 73B, subsection 12.4. Filed, timestamped, archived. Just like that, I was back. Not in title, not in name, but in undeniable function. For 6 weeks, the systems, protocols, leases, and structural operations of the campus were under my legal stewardship, and I made no announcement. Instead, I did what leaders do when things break. I worked. By 10:13 a.m., access logs were normalized. By noon, the facility's routing schedules were restored. By 2:30 p.m., the company's internal comms tool, dormant in confusion for days, lit up with one system-wide message. Operational continuity restored. Temporary stewardship enacted per clause 12.4. DL, 3 letters. That was all. No reply came from her office, but I knew she saw it. At 4:41 p.m., the campus lights flickered in synchronized sequence, a reboot protocol I'd written during the second expansion phase. A heartbeat, every building reconnected, every terminal verified. The ghost had re-entered the machine. Later that evening, I returned to the West Wing. My badge, long deactivated, now blinked green. I entered the data vault alone. Inside, the living core of what we built. Temperature steady, humming with life. And there, on the glass desk where I used to write infrastructure memos by hand, lay a single envelope. Her handwriting. Inside, a blank sheet and my name. No apology, no explanation, just space. It said more than her HR memo ever did. Sometimes silence is the only real admission. When they strip you of your chair, Rebuild your throne from the wiring, and wait. The empire will remember who kept the lights on. Day 8 was the turning point, not in volume, but in vibration. The campus had stabilized. Systems were humming. Vendor contracts began flowing back in. Even the insurance pause was lifted. But something deeper had shifted, not just in operations, but in people. Because when leadership collapses, it's not the hierarchy that saves the day. It's memory. The woman in records who remembered my birthday. The facilities lead who once fixed a burst pipe with me at midnight. The engineer who learned infrastructure by shadowing me, notebook in hand. They started reaching out. Not out of loyalty, out of recognition. Not to me, to the architecture itself. The invisible frame of trust they had all been working within. She remained silent. Rumors whispered that she had retreated to an off-site suite downtown. Her assistant was seen boxing up files. One of the interns posted a cryptic message on social. We thought she brought a vision. Turns out, she just brought shoes. Meanwhile, I received a call from the chair of the board. Diane, he said, tone softer than I'd ever heard. The override was masterful. It was necessary, I replied. He hesitated, then offered something unexpected. We'd like to formally reinstate your position. Not interim, not advisor. Full return, nameplate, authority. Vote. I leaned back, watching the dusk bleed through my apartment window. It's not the title I want, I said. It's the correction. He understood. I agreed to draft a transitional proposal, one that would not just restore, but reframe, new protections, new clarity on infrastructure ownership, and, most importantly, education for the next leadership generation. Not her, but the ones after. By the time the lights dimmed that night, the heartbeat of the campus pulsed evenly. The empire hadn't collapsed. It had awakened. There's no revenge in being right, only responsibility in being remembered. Day 9 was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm rewrites the landscape. When the wreckage has settled, the power's been restored, and people walk slower, listen deeper. That morning, I returned to the building, not as a ghost, not as a title, but as the architect who'd never really left. The lobby was brighter than I remembered, or maybe I was. The security guard nodded at me, no badge needed. The receptionist smiled, eyes wide with a mixture of apology and relief. No one asked questions. They knew. I took the elevator alone, not to the top floor, to the basement. Because that's where the heartbeat lives, in the whirring servers, the temperature-controlled walls, the logs and backups, the logic gates humming like neurons. Places she never visited, places she never earned. I walked the rows, tracing the familiar beeps, touched the panel that still had my initials etched behind a loose hinge, an old habit from long nights of system checks. And I said thank you, not to the machines. To myself. For having the foresight to document, the courage to design for chaos, the patience to let silence speak louder than vengeance. Upstairs, someone had already updated the leadership roster on the intranet. Her name was gone. No press release, no LinkedIn exit memo, just deleted. In her place, Stewardship Committee, led by DL. I would never frame that, never quote it. Never use it as leverage, because real architects don't flaunt their blueprints. They just build so well, even betrayal can't shake the frame. That evening, I exited through the side corridor, the one I used during construction years ago. A subtle nod to beginnings. The courtyard lights flickered on, timed perfectly. One final reminder, the structure remembers who loved it. Some inherit titles, others leave fingerprints in steel and signatures in code. I chose the latter, and it chose me back.